We have Mr. McMahon.
Thank you, Anna. To this small page, as you know, my name is McMahon. I act for the current group committee, Justice Committee in the room. And in case it hasn't already been made plain from other questions, for those who are watching from afar, not only have you been here for pretty much the entirety of the inquest, that's correct.
Correct.
But also you've made yourself freely available outside the court to talk to the lawyers involved or any of the parties and have discussions on many of the issues which have now been the subject of it.
Yeah, I've been here frequently, Your Honour, yes.
And it's fair enough to say, isn't it, that when we look at the breadth of the reform that's been going on in the last few years, that it's been a massive enterprise.
Yes.
And, I hesitate to use the word revolutionary in the context of police reform, but it's a major and significant rethinking and effort to improve the Northern Territory Police Force.
I believe so, Your Honour. I think the most significant in a decade or more.
You're just going to have to speak up with me on the phone.
Sorry, I think it's the most significant, one of the most significant ones I've ever been involved with, and from, I think, for over a decade.
And it's obvious, isn't it, that not only these kinds of reforms that you've outlined, either in your evidence but also in the documents which you haven't been taken to, which are part of your evidence in the affidavits, that a great deal of administrative skill is needed to implement the reforms, correct?
Yes.
And a lot of vision and courage is needed to undertake and complete that task.
Yes, Your Honour.
So recognising all of those things, and in that context, I'm going to ask you questions which are not designed to undermine that work or to be critical of the work that you've been doing, but really to point out that in some areas significantly more is needed. Do you understand?
I think, yes, Your Honour, and I'm here to listen and to come up, hopefully, with solutions to improve our service delivery.
So I'm going to ask you questions about guns, and
Yes.
I'm telling you this so that for your answers you know what's coming later.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you questions about guns and dogs,
Yes.
training at college,
Yes.
racism,
Yes.
and militarisation of
Yes.
the Northern Territory Police Force. Follow?
Yes.
Now, you commenced your evidence with an apology, and it was a wide-ranging apology, which I suggest was a measure of the impact that this case has had on the Northern Territory Police Force. You agree with that? It was obviously a deeply thought out apology, wasn't it?
Yes.
And you'd be aware that you're probably, in terms of time, I may be corrected, in terms of time, you're probably the longest witness we've had in this inquest. Are you aware of that?
My pleasure. Your Honour.
It's credibility.
And you've given hundreds of pages of evidence in affidavits, which most people watching won't get to hear about. But it all amounts to a great deal of effort, and which is obviously appreciated by everybody. So just looking at your apology, you apologised for the carrying of long arms, and you said, "We apologise for carrying long arms in Yuendamu and acknowledge the apprehension that caused the community." Remember that being in your apology?
I do.
And it's clear from all of your written evidence and your oral evidence that the idea of open carry long arms around the community, that practice is effectively gone from the Northern Territory Police Force.
It's not supported, that's correct.
Correct? Except with some very clearly defined exceptions.
Where there's need,
A high-risk job for TRG or something like that.
destruction of an animal, some
So
appropriate task. Your Honour.
when you say we apologise for the carrying long arms in Yuendamu, and built into that is the broader territory-wide response to carrying of arms in communities, what is it That is the basis for that apology. We apologise for carrying long arms in India. What's the basis for that apology?
Clearly,
why do they cause apprehension?
I think I referenced that, Your Honour, in the following paragraph to the Coniston massacre, but specifically for the community Yundaba, I'm not aware where we've routinely carried long arms anywhere else. I've yet to be, I'm aware of this instance, so specifically apologies directed to this community, but I'm not aware of long arms being carried anywhere else in my time here.
Fair enough. So what's the basis for the apology? Why is it that you feel the need to apologise?
The evidence that I've heard before this court, Your Honour, is identify the level of angst and distress that caused the community.
You're aware from sitting in and from observing generally that on behalf of the Parampuru Committee, people of Yunda Move, we've asked plenty of questions about the carrying of Glocks as well. You've given significant evidence in your affidavits and also orally about that. And we've asked questions about, to the effect that in our submission, we'll be saying that police are mistakenly of the view that they need to carry those guns. You understand that's an issue between your perspective and the perspective of my client, don't you?
I accept that is your perspective, yes.
And when you were being asked questions in chief from Dr. Freckleton, there was mention in passing to countries that where police routinely do not carry guns on their holster. Remember
Yes.
that? Countries such as England and Wales. And Dr. Freckleton didn't mention all of these, but just so that everyone understands the countries we're talking about. Countries like England and Wales, Ireland, Norway, and closer to home, New Zealand, Fiji, Samoa, those kinds of countries. You aware of all that?
Accept that, Your Honour. And
to summarise what you've covered in a wide range of affidavit material, oral evidence, you say that from your perspective and by you throughout these questions, I'm assuming the point that Mr. Bone made, that you means the Northern Territory Police Force.
yes,
That the carrying of guns on the hip is a necessary integral part of the kit and essential to Northern Territory Police.
yes it is.
And you say it's a matter of safety because you don't ever know what might be just around the corner.
It's correct.
So, to contrast that, you also, correct me if I'm wrong, but ALOs don't carry weapons.
No, they don't. They're not sworn police officers.
But of course, they're often in similarly dangerous situations as sworn police officers.
I would hope not, Your Honour.
Well, for instance, you gave an example as a justification, for example, of domestic violence, where an ALO might well be a suitable person to have around when the police attend a domestic violence situation.
I would expect, Your Honour, that the ALOs perform a liaison role. They're not performing a response role. Their role is not to be actively engaged, sitting in police vehicles, tasking to police response. They're to provide community support, community engagement, provide us guidance. They're not police officers. And I don't expect them to be treated as such, and I don't expect them to perform as such.
Do they ever wear a uniform?
They wear shirts with a motive on them and I think a dark blue pants.
What does the motive say?
It's just a Aboriginal design T-shirt.
Do you accept that we won't go over what Night Patrol does, a lot of evidence in this court already about that, and you know a great deal about it, I'm sure. But you accept that people on Night Patrol regularly attend situations which are potentially dangerous?
Potentially, yes.
And you accept, of course, that they do that without carrying lethal weapons?
I accept that, Your Honour. They're not police officers.
And you know that this court has heard evidence from Aboriginal people that police carrying guns, by guns I'm talking about Glocks now, causes anxiety to the community rather than comfort to the community. You've heard that evidence?
From my observations, both from attending at Yuendamu and others, I accept there's a sense that they would much prefer we didn't carry firearms.
And going back to your theme that it's necessary to do so that police can be ready for whatever situation involves. You used the example of the recent murder of police in New South Wales, in Queensland.
I use that as one example.
Yeah.
I can give
I know
dozens if you wish more, Your Honour.
But to use your example, you accept that the tragic case, the police in that case had conducted, according to police command, and I'm getting my information from, on this question from watching police command speak on ABC news shows and so on, that there was a risk assessment made before the police went to that property, as we would expect. You accept that happened?
Yeah.
And that the police who attended that property were in fact armed.
Yes.
So despite the risk assessment and despite being armed and not knowing what was around the corner, in that context they were nevertheless murdered. And you accept that it's an example that there are some kinds of murders and assassinations that being armed simply won't be able to prevent. And that's a classic example.
Well, no, I don't accept that as a general principle. No, I don't. I think as a member of the police force who responds to any task 24/7, sometimes with limited to no knowledge, you need the capability to protect both yourself, the members and the community. You can't do that if you haven't got a Glock pistol with you.
That wasn't my question. My question to you, a proposition to you, which I'm asking you to accept, which frankly I think is self-evident, is that there are some kinds of murders, some kinds of assassinations, such as the murder of police officers in that Queensland example, that simply being armed won't be able to prevent. Pretty self-evident, isn't it?
Well, Your Honour, I think...
You'll get a chance to say the philosophy that you want to talk about.
I am struggling to reach a simple yes or no answer to that because, again, I'm not...
I mean, there's so many variables.
Yes.
There are so many variables.
If someone creeps up behind you, shoots you in the back of the head and you've got a gun, it's no value to you at all. There's instances where, beyond the comprehension of normal...
That concession that's the point I'm making.
Okay, I accept that sometimes you can't predict every contingency. I'll accept that, Your Honour.
Now, I don't expect you to be an academic who's read a whole lot of research papers on the 30 or 40 significant issues that you've had to deal with. But I do want to take you to some paragraphs from some of the material that's on the brief, and you probably haven't read it. It's the report of Professor Canning for the benefit of others, which is Exhibit 10-10AA. Just by chance, has that been given to you, Professor Chris Canning's?
No, I haven't got that, Your Honour. No.
He's a professor at the University of Technology in Sydney.
No, I haven't got that. I haven't read that, Your Honour.
As I say, I don't expect you to have read or studied some of these issues as an academic, and I appreciate that much of what you say is based on your professional experience rather than something different to that. But I just want to put you some ideas that he has put in his report, which are part of the evidence that Her Honour will have to consider, and that concerns this question of police carrying pistols. Follow?
Yes?
So he says at paragraph 32, he's talking about...
I wonder if Beck has it there. Do you want it up on the screen?
Not really, one.
Okay.
I mean, I think it would be a instruction. I'm just going to put some ideas to you. If you want them on the screen, just say so. Is that
Which would you mind? Sure, thank you.
I now remember that we asked for it to be ready to be put on the screen. So can you see that there, Deputy Commissioner? So this is a report which covers a number of issues, but the paragraphs I'm looking at, particularly paragraph 32 and 33. And we don't want to get lost in the statistics and the data, but rather the broader picture. Now, the broader picture here is that Professor Canine is referring to comparisons in police killings across numerous countries. You understand that?
Again, Your Honour, the terminology police killing, does that necessarily refer to a shooting, or is it a arm lock, a stranglehold, some other?
It's based,
Doesn't.
based on fatal shootings.
Okay, thank
So
you.
if you see the second line of paragraph
Okay, yep.
32, primarily based on fatal shootings. So some of them may not be fatal shootings.
Yep.
But to get to the end point, and we'll go through it in a minute, but the end point is a question of whether communities are safer or not safer just because the police carry guns. Do you understand?
Yes.
That's the issue. And there's a comparison there of a rate of 10 million of the population in the US, 33.5 per 10 million of the population. That's how many police killings there were. And there's some other statistics we'll come to today, but just so you don't get distracted, Deputy Commissioner, not very interested in statistics from the USA because they're a completely different environment where there are something like 3 police killings every day of every year. So for reasons which are not necessary to explore here, that country is not much use to us. But the next set of countries are more used. You see the rate there for Canada is 9.8, for Australia it's 8.5, much lower numbers for Netherlands, New Zealand, Germany, England and Wales. You see that? In paragraph 32?
I do, Your Honour, but I'm not sure the currency of that figure. Some recent data, I believe New Zealand may be somewhat different now.
Because of, this may have been written before the terrorist attack. Is that what you're referring to?
Oh, and some other literature I've read around shootings.
The statistic there refers to 2021, so it's fairly recent.
And there's been recent police officers murdered in New Zealand. There's been a number of high-profile police shootings in the last 2 years that I'm aware of, Your Honour.
So if you turn to paragraph 33, the point that the author is making is that Canadian and Australian police who routinely carry firearms have high rates in other countries in the prison policy initiative. Now, when we're looking at this, the countries that are of most interest to us are obviously countries that are as close as sensibly can be done and comparable to us. And countries like New Zealand, England, Australia and Canada, which have many cultural similarities, and of course every country is different, but we appreciate that of all the countries in the world, those four do have many cultural similarities in terms of history of government,
Democracy, yeah, similarities, yes.
and the positive role that police are meant to play in the community as opposed to having a military autocratic presence.
Strong oversight, different body. I accept that, Your Honour.
Yeah, so that's what we're dealing with. And halfway through that paragraph, you see he says that, for example, on a yearly basis, Australia regularly has double or more fatal shootings compared to England and Wales, although it has only half the general population. And this pattern has been consistent over the longer term, effectively between 1990 and 2021. You see that?
I accept the figures, Your Honour.
And then the next sentence, which is really the one that matters for our purposes, is that other research suggests that there is no clear evidence that arming police automatically or necessarily makes them or the community safer. Do you see that?
Yes, Your Honour.
Okay, so the reason I'm putting all that to you is, as you understand, we'll be putting submissions later and relying on this material. And it's in contrast with the approach that you've taken in the witness box, which is that it's necessary, essential and integral to policing that the police be armed.
Well, Your Honour, I think there's some contextual differences in terms of the localities of the country, their size, their demographic, their population, their locality for support. You know, you're in London CBD, they've got, you know, they do have armed police within very, very close proximity to respond. We're talking very remote parts of Australia with little or no support for hours at times in some instances to get support and help. I think the community expect that the police will be there to assist, and the Glock is just a tool that we use, and it's a defensive weapon primarily.
You've talked about sort of backup and resources being available quickly in other countries or other locations, but in my experience, most policing in communities is not done without a vehicle. Why couldn't guns be kept in the vehicle, which is invariably very close by?
Your Honour, I can give numerous examples in my experience where police officers have been beaten, have been injured, and the only thing that they are alive today is because they had a firearm. And they had no fire on them, they wouldn't have had the opportunity, the ability to get to a vehicle to get help. And I'm aware from my time in the Pilbara, where we had a armed police officer was viciously assaulted on a routine traffic stop and was knocked nearly unconscious on the ground and managed to withdraw his firearm and shoot that person, who subsequently we find had murdered 2 women in Melbourne, was driving around Australia aimlessly. He'd be dead today if he didn't have a firearm. In my experience...
There are examples. I appreciate fully the depth and breadth of your experience, and that you can find examples like that, and that no one doubts the reality of what you're saying. But there are also many other examples to the exact opposite effect. For instance, and we'll come to it shortly, if policing had been done differently on the 9th of the 11th, and the police were not carrying lethal weapons on that evening, Kumanjayi Walker would not have been killed. So we can draw individual examples. The purpose of what I'm doing here is not to support or oppose individual examples, but to make the point to you that there is sensible and significant research which shows that whether or not reasonable minds differ, nevertheless, it is sensible to say that arming police does not automatically make them or the community safer. Look at it across many countries which are similar to Australia over many years. You appreciate that?
I accept that that's what that academic data shows. That's not my lived experience. That's not the Australasian police position, except from New Zealand. Every police force within Australia, by agreement, are armed.
Yeah. So, I mean, to be blunt about it, Deputy, on a number of issues I'm going to come back to you with this point, that just because something's being done a certain way forever doesn't mean it has to be done that way into the future. And I know that you accept that from other areas of your work.
Where the Northern Territory Police Force can improve our service delivery, our interaction with the community, we remain committed to looking at options, yes.
And on this point, which I'm not going to keep labelling, but on this point, I'm putting out to you something which doesn't really seem to have emerged from your affidavit material and from the research that the people who assisted you to write your affidavits at police headquarters, wherever they are, have come to grips with, is the fact that there is a sensible body of research to show across comparable countries where there are rural and isolated in New Zealand, Wales, England, Ireland, and there are plenty of isolated rural villages and communities in those countries as well, with people who are in so many ways culturally similar to ourselves, that in those contexts, the research shows over a 30-year period that it's not automatically or necessarily making the community safer just because police have guns. And there is lots of data to show to the contrary. Now, I appreciate your views. I'm just pointing out to you so that you know where we're going, that this is something that we say you haven't come to grips with. Do you understand?
Thank you, but I don't agree.
Okay. And we will be saying that the way you talk about it, which is fair enough, is a deeply ingrained assumption that you and executive no doubt hold, and that it requires a major shift in culture and attitude. And part of that shift will be an openness to the ideas that, such as the ones I'm putting to you right now. Follow?
I accept that, Your Honour, and I think, again, perhaps it hasn't been articulated clearly, but I think there are instances where police, when they're not performing stringent operational duties, don't carry firearms, for example. If we're out there doing operational patrolling, we're always going to be equipped to respond to any task. I mean, police officer off duty walks down to the store at Yuendamu to buy food, and they're off duty, they're not going to carry a firearm. The community still know they're a police officer. They're still under an obligation. They're going to respond to something if it happens. But when we're performing operational tasking duties, it is one of the necessary tools that we use, and it's also to protect our members, and an obligation upon us by law to provide adequate safety equipment to our workforce.
One of the points you just made is a powerful point that we'll be making in our submissions. When the police officer walks down the street in Yuendamu, known to be a police officer, where anything might happen at any time, that person is unarmed if they're not doing operational duties.
Every day, police officers work X number of hours, but when they're responding to tasking and may be called and they're equipped and anything could happen, I expect, and I think the community expect, that the responders are equipped to be able to preserve life and property and help people.
And just so it's clear in your mind, because of one answer you gave the other day when you used the word unarmed, we're not suggesting police should be unarmed, we're suggesting effectively no change to the accoutrement belt, except the capacity for immediate lethal force. Follow? So you've got tasers, batons, handcuffs and so on. You understand I'm not suggesting that police should be unarmed. Do you understand that?
I accept that, but again, in context, Your Honour, the training provided doesn't instantly means you go to lethal force. That's why we provide other non-lethal force options to police officers, so that the use of a firearm is the last resort.
Sure. But you understand, this is where the debate is, Deputy. You say the training provides and it's individual and so on. What I'm putting to you is that it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And just as you talk about community safety, from my client's point of view, they feel less safe when the police have guns, and you know that to be the case, and you've already said that in evidence today. So, using the Kumanjayi Walker case as an example, and bearing in mind the point that Her Honour raised as a question with you on the question of vehicles being nearby. Now we understand, I'm just putting this in context so people haven't followed the whole inquest, that you can have a vehicle parked nearby which can store weapons, whether it's rifles and pistols. That's plain, isn't it?
The context, Your Honour, which I provide there is around long arms. In my expectation, the long arms will be secured in the vehicle. Yeah,
but the point is, a police vehicle which pulls up outside a house in any Aboriginal community or anywhere in Northern Territory, if it's not already fitted, can easily be fitted with appropriate storage facility for a lethal weapon such as a long arm. And that's now the standard practice in the Territory when long arms have been
conveyed.
Correct?
That's my understanding, yes, Your Honour.
And the point I'm making for those who haven't followed all of the evidence is that obviously the same can be done with pistols. The same storage can be utilised with pistols.
I suspect they can, Your Honour. They can secure in a vehicle. Again,
I appreciate you don't want that to happen.
Well, it's against our current position, yes, Your Honour.
So bearing that in mind, and looking at the Kumanjayi Walker case, I want to test what we're saying against the idea that not only should the AR-15 have been stored in the vehicle, and I understand that's your clear evidence.
Yes.
Putting aside the question of who was in control and what time events should have happened and so on, but accepting for the purpose of this discussion right now, the IRT went to the house at 7 o'clock in the evening, or about then, and things unfolded as they were going to unfold. Now, accepting that that's the factual scenario, you would then say, well, if they were doing that and if they were there and if they were armed, I would have expected the AR-15 would remain secured in the vehicle. Follow?
Yes.
And you agree with that?
Yes.
And what I'm now developing with you is that we are suggesting, and so too should the Glocks. Follow?
I do follow, but I don't accept that.
You don't have to keep saying you don't accept it. No one for a moment is going to think that you accept it.
Okay, thank you.
based on the fact that you've said it so clearly and
Thank you.
purposely, both in your written documents and in the witness box. Follow? But what you have said in your evidence is effectively that when those men were there, the IOT was there, they had a 5-man formation, 3 out and 2 in, and you said that it indicates that there was a plan in place, it wasn't just a random thing, that they had structure and so on, that they knew someone was in the house and the tactics should have been varied, but rather they did exactly what happened last time in the axe incident a few days ago. That's the effect of what you've said. Now, if they, you've also said that if they were going to get in, they should have got a local. But clearly the best course of action would have been to get a local person, not probably a local policeman. But
Well, that was the plan, Your Honour.
yeah, and we all understand that, we're all in agreement with that, but I'm just giving you context. But can I suggest to you what would have happened next if not only was the AR-15 secured, but also the Glocks were secured? So then you have the house, they'd searched one house, so it's, rather than searching one house, let's assume that they've got the target in the house, and that's the point that they got to at house 511. And as you've said, they knew that there was someone in the house at 511. If the Glocks were in the vehicle and there were 4 IRT plus Glocks on the set, but we'll just talk about the 4 IRT. If the Glock was in the vehicle, what happens next? We agree that the strategy would have to have been, firstly, the concept of cordon and contain the house. You agree with that?
Yes.
And what would necessarily happen then, where of course there's no intelligence and no suggestion that Kumanjayi Walker is armed with a rifle or a gun himself. Follow?
Yeah.
And there may have been, and it would have been a fair enough assumption that he may reach out and grab an edged weapon, because we know he's already done it once before.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's the scenario we're dealing with. What happens next is that they have to, the police have to engage in a strategy which requires cordon and contain, patience, negotiation, working with the ACPO or the ALO, whatever was available at the time, and perhaps working with elders or family at the time. That would have had to have been the approach. If the police said, we think Kumanjayi Walker's in that house and we're here to arrest him, we're going to arrest him, we're not going away. You agree with all that?
It was a long statement, so again,
Is
you're
there any
right.
part of it you disagree with?
Well, the bit that just because they're not carrying guns, they wouldn't have gone in the door, or they wouldn't have made some other actions that would have led to his apprehension. I would have thought the earlier advice about the axe incident would have alerted them that it was a higher potential, and they would respond appropriately. All the other things I agree with. We could have knocked on the door, we could have cordon contained, I'm happy. I think that's what we're suggesting should have happened. Should have stuck to the plan, should have gone at 5 o'clock in the morning.
But for the purpose of our discussion now, we're not at 5 o'clock in the morning, we're at the house at 7 o'clock, there are 4 policemen outside, and I'm suggesting to you that if they did not carry lethal weapons, the scenario would necessarily have unfolded in a different and better way. That is to say, in exactly the way that you've promoted so thoroughly and carefully in other parts of your evidence and in your general philosophy, the support for community policing, the support for using the other tools that are available, all of which are embedded in the way that you approach your work and that you want the Northern Territory Police to do their work.
Mr. Officer.
I'll let you finish, but I object to part of the question, albeit it's a very long question. And the part I object to is the part which he says that they weren't carrying firearms at 7 o'clock at the time they went to the house. It all would have happened differently. That's just asking for rank speculation.
That's what he is asking for. He's not asking for rank speculation. He's asking for consideration of a variation in policy and how that might affect policing and police choices, options, the way they make decisions. I think that's what he's asking.
Well, I
don't think it's rank speculation.
I certainly think the question has framed that something different would have happened. It's called into speculation.
Well,
A number of possible scenarios which I don't assist you on. This has been asked and answered that firearms will be carried. Just to speculate what might happen.
and this is the challenge to that statement. That's what's happening here, Mr. Officer. There's a different argument.
Two police officers might have been dead. That's the one possible answer, but it's speculative.
That is a possible outcome, I suppose.
And it's one that it's fair enough to put that point, and I'm not denying at all that we're talking about speculation, because the Deputy Commissioner and I are exploring an hypothesis which deals with his evidence that guns are necessary. And just to be clear on that point about whether two police officers could have been killed, you recognise that I've previously put to you that the intelligence in the preparation for that arrest, in the scenario that we're discussing, includes an assessment that the target, Mr. Walker, is not armed. You accepted that?
Is not armed with a firearm.
Is not armed with a firearm.
I'm trying to be considered, Your Honour, and reflect upon this instance and my lived experience. When I joined as a police and when I was in remote policing, we didn't carry firearms at all. So again, I've operated in an operating context where we just didn't carry firearms. They were locked away in the police station. Now, those times, if we were confronted with something, the risk assessment probably would have indicated that you do carry a firearm. But because we now routinely carry firearms, it doesn't enter that same threshold of what we would do. So if you knew in advance and you didn't carry a firearm, and again, I suspect maybe a New Zealand police officer may give us some better context where they don't routinely carry them. In this case, I suspect they would have routinely carried, or they would have carried them for that operation because it was a heightened awareness. And again, that would be done dynamically, it would be done in the field, it wouldn't necessarily take the form of a written risk assessment, but you wouldn't routinely put yourself in harm's way if you know you've got other options available to you, regardless of whether, when I was a young constable, we didn't carry guns at all. So we'd have to arm ourselves with rubbish bin lids and other things that today modern policing prevents. I think it's much more safer.
Just to finish on this topic, you've given two examples of where you don't carry, in your lived experience, you not carry. One was as an early constable, and
Yes.
that's in Western Australia.
Yes.
And just so we understand, when did that change, that you went from routinely not carrying?
Probably we didn't start routinely carrying firearms till I'd suspect mid to late 80s, when it was more like night shift, you'd wear a firearm. Other than that, you didn't carry a firearm during day shift and afternoon shift, and you worked on your own. It didn't routinely arm till mid 80s, late 80s. When I was a constable at Kununurra, 85, 86, we did not carry firearms.
The other example you gave was that you were talking about, even in the context of Northern Territory Police, you said, well, they don't always carry firearms, and you were about to give some examples of when that might be the case, when they do not carry firearms. I can't put my finger on that specific example. I thought the larger Manu officers who we heard from the two witnesses say that they don't carry firearms. Is that the evidence we heard?
We did.
And I think when we made inquiries, we ascertained, no, when we're operationally focused to do stuff, we carry our firearms. But I think I did hear some other context around if it was a pre-arranged visit to the school, if it was some other activity where they didn't think, and they'd done a risk assessment, they didn't think they needed it, and for sensitivity, they didn't do it. Now that's a local discretion decision making that I think happens routinely in the field, that as the Deputy Commissioner of Police, with all due respect, I can't paint a picture of every locality in the Northern Territory at any given moment in time that we would police officers use discretion route for a whole manner of things. Now, it's not for operational purpose. When we're out there on patrol, our expectation remains the same, that they are kitted up and ready to respond to anything that comes their way. And the carrying of firearms is one of the items we issue to them to enable them to do that role. So I know it doesn't help probably, but...
We'll leave that topic now. I think it's clear the differences between my client's view and your view, and the rest will be the subject of submissions. Can I turn to what will, in this context will be a minor point in terms of time, which is the question of racism. And I'm sure you appreciate that we are in no way interested in tarring everyone with the same brush with the Northern Territory Police Force. You understand that, don't you?
Yes.
And in fact, I'm sure you understand that from the point of view of my client, the Kurrumburu Committee, who represent Inquest, the ultimate objective of this inquest for my client, at least one of the key objectives, is to ensure that the Northern Territory Police operates as best it can so that people like my client's community and the Northern Territory Police can work and live harmoniously and with mutual respect and so on. You understand that?
Yes.
But you also understand that your affidavit is evidence and will be the subject of submissions. And in your third affidavit, at paragraph 59, I want to give you a chance to change your evidence. You've got all three of your affidavits?
I have it right in front of me, yep.
Okay, so paragraph 59 says the Northern Territory Police Force accepts that there are several individuals among its membership who have engaged in racist, etc., behaviour.
Yes.
Now, I want to give you a chance to change that because by any normal use of that language, several means a few, 3 or 4, whatever means in that. And I want to suggest to you that that's just simply completely at odds with what we already know from the evidence in this case. I'm in no way suggesting that the Northern Territory Police majority or as an institution, etc., is standing around being racist, but it's far more than just several, isn't it?
I'm trying to form a word that may articulate something that satisfies you, Ms McMahon, around the number that we've heard. I'm aware of other instances outside the scope of this inquest as well that we've been involved with. So I do accept that there are several out of 1,600, could be 10, 30. I don't know what the issue with the terminology several. It was a language I've adopted.
My issue is that it suggests an extremely low number of about 3 or 4, and I don't want to be tied down making submissions. That's so obviously wrong.
Okay, well, again, the evidence before this court, and what I know, it's more than 3 or 4. Several was the word I used. Numerous, couple. I mean, I don't necessarily.
That's what we need to do. I just need to make sure you're not trying to stick to that point, and I accept. We've had many conversations.
Yeah, okay. I accept. There's again. I don't want to get in a fight over words, Mr. McMahon.
I don't want you to give a number. I just want you to accept that that's not a proposition you're maintaining.
Correct, and the reinforcement of the message that we don't tolerate it, and we're taking active steps to remove it from our culture and our force.
Your Honour, just so the transcript reads correctly, I think it's clear that the Deputy Commissioner is not adopting the concern that our learned friend has. Several means 3 or 4. He's openly saying to you, it's a number in excess of that. It's not prevalent, but it's quite a number in his instance, 10 or so. There might be more, but it's a bit of a narrow debate about the meaning of several, I think.
10, 30, he doesn't know. He used the word numerous, but I think he's saying it's more than several, but it's much, much, much less than the majority.
Take that. I don't think he was saying to Your Honour that it's numerous people who have been racist. He was wrestling with trying to find a word,
An alternative word, you
which captures more than 3 or 4, but less than many.
I'm content with that, Roy, and certainly, as you say in the following paragraph, that it's not the entire membership or even the majority.
Thank you. Yes.
Can I take you to the issue of the use of force by dogs in the Northern Territory Police Force? And in this context, you've referred to this issue in your third affidavit at paragraph 151.
Yes.
And attached to your affidavit, you've provided what's called use of force data review, dog operations unit. It's MSO8. For the benefit of others. And I want you to consider a number of propositions which underlie the questions that I'm going to ask you to follow.
Yes.
And they are that the use of dogs in the Northern Territory, by dogs of course throughout this I'm talking about using police dogs to effect arrest and will be part of it.
And to assist in the arrest, I think that's the context.
Assist in the arrest. Thank you. The use of dogs in the Northern Territory is heavily weighted against Aboriginal people, and because of that, it's burdened with racial implications. And the reason I'm putting that proposition to you is from the data that you've provided that the use of dogs is overwhelmingly used against Aboriginal people. Follow? Follow that proposition?
I think that's recorded at paragraph 161. Is that what you're referring to?
I'm not referring to a particular paragraph at this moment. I'm just that's the data that I will be taking. But that's the proposition I want you to consider. The second proposition I want you to consider is that using dogs to attack or injure humans at all is an unacceptable use of force.
Well, Your Honour, I object to the term attack. I think the police dogs are trained to do a specific task. They're not trained to attack people. They're trained to track. They're trained to hold people till other members can arrive. I don't know that they would. Please, yes, thank you.
You understand the word apprehend has a particular meaning in this context, which is the dog grabs the person.
Or may bite you. Yes.
And so the proposition I'm putting to you is that it's unacceptable to use dogs for that purpose, except, and this is anticipating what you may say, except in an extreme example such as an active armed killer. And I know that's occurred in the territory.
Your Honour, I think position of the Northern Territory Police Force is that they provide a valuable tool to our community and to police officers. They are designed to assist us, and I don't agree with the proposition that we willy-nilly use them out there. They are a valuable resource. They're expensive to maintain. They're well trained, and they provide, I think, outstanding ability that probably that capability removed from the police, we would struggle in some instances. You know, particularly their skill at tracking. It's just amazing.
Well, to be clear, these questions are not about tracking and finding people who are lost and so on. We're talking about...
Well, not just lost.
We're talking about dogs apprehending humans, which is grabbing them, holding them with their mouth, and in some countries, some examples, injuring them so they have to go to hospital. You understand? That's what we're talking about.
I understand your proposition, Mr. McMahon. I'm not, from the evidence that I've been presented to me as the Deputy Commissioner, have that same view. It's a very, very low number of animals that bite or receive injuries. When I talk about tracking, from my information provided to me, just because an animal tracks you, you flee from a stolen car, you've run from a burglary, you've run from a scene of a crime, doesn't necessarily mean that the animal will actually bite anybody. They use them to track, find out where they're hiding. There's opportunities then for police officers and the dog to call people to surrender, come forward. It's not as just let the dog run free. That's not how they operate. I think that is a hugely valuable tool for one of the core functions of policing, you know, identify in law enforcement.
The third proposition I want you to consider is that dogs should never, allowing for the fact that you might say we need dogs for these reasons, dogs should never be used against children and teenagers.
As a generic principle, I don't know that they, I would accept that as a high level premise. I don't know they are routinely, obviously responding police, including those with dog handlers, when they respond to an incident, may not know who the offenders are. So at times, you know, it's very difficult to make an assertion that it's going to be children. So,
well, even in this case, we know that they were used against a young Kumanjayi walker who escaped from some youth detention facility. So as an example, that was using dogs against someone known to be a young person. I think it was either 15 or 16 at the time.
I've heard evidence, Your Honour, that he had been, but as I said, generically, I don't know that our dog handlers routinely task the animals to target children. I don't think that's the case.
Well, that's not quite the proposition I'm putting to you.
Okay, thank you.
The proposition is that it's clear enough, it seems, that they are sometimes tasked to apprehend children.
I'd accept, Your Honour, that may be the outcome, but I don't, you know, as I said, police officers responding to tasks, jobs, crimes, don't necessarily know the identity of who the offender would be. And certainly the dog can't discriminate between an adult or a juvenile.
And you accept that in the Northern Territory, of the people who are young people who are detained, is approximately 100% Aboriginal youth. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's 95%. Do you accept that data?
Again, I haven't got it in front of me, but it sounds probably correct.
The number of people in prison, adult prison, male adult prison, or adult prisons overall actually, is around the 85 or up to 90% Aboriginal.
I would accept those figures at face value, yes.
So that every strategy that perhaps I shouldn't say every, but most strategies employed by the Northern Territory Police Force, including the dog strategies, whatever they might be, are predominantly employed against Aboriginal people.
In an urban environment, it might be somewhat different, Mr. McGunn, but I suspect, yes, with a remote and regional policing model, predominantly policing Aboriginal communities.
And you use the example of finding people who are hiding. So to bring that back to this case, and House 511 on the night of 9 November, there was a dog there ready to do whatever it needed to do to apprehend Kumanjayi Walker. You know that evidence.
Yes, I do.
And so to put my proposition to you in context, in that situation, if he had run off into the bush, why not just let him go and pick him up a day or so later rather than release a dog to chase him and apprehend him?
I think that, well, they didn't do that. That's the first thing. There was an opportunity, though, that again, they could have apprehended him much more quickly. I think we have heard evidence in the inquest about the fatigue, the resourcing, you know, even when you've got a group of people from somewhere else in town, the impact upon that from where they've come from. You know, every time we move one resource from one locality to another.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Detective.
Sorry,
but
did I miss the point?
people aren't getting patient with me
Sorry.
for too long. The point is that assuming and acknowledging all of those factors, if Kumanjayi Walker had run off into the bush, then if the decision had been made to release the dog, to chase him and apprehend him, I'm putting to you the proposition, why not just let him go and pick him up a day later?
I think it was part of their operational plan. I think it was sound tactics. I have no issue with the fact that his apprehension at that point in time, if they deployed that, was appropriate. I'll bring back to the point though, the mere deployment of the dog doesn't mean he was going to bite him. The dog would have,
Say that again?
the mere deployment of the dog doesn't mean he was going to get bitten.
No, of course not.
No, the officers would have gone with the dog. They could have, you know, the dog would have barked. It would have done a whole lot of commands to surrender. You know, it would have assisted greatly with the apprehension, usually in a non-violent way.
So it seems from your data On the other hand, what your data does show is roughly monthly, every month, an Aboriginal person is apprehended and injured by a dog. That's what your data shows. I'll take you to the numbers if you need. Now, perhaps the difference between us is saying whether that's acceptable or not. I'm putting to you that it's completely unacceptable, and you're saying no. On the other hand, it's a useful tool.
I think it is our position, the Northern Territory Police, they provide an extremely valuable option for Northern Territory Police. There's no suggestion, if I can add some context around it, that it had police officers chase them, apprehended them, physically fought them, that there wouldn't have been injuries to the police officer and to the victim, you know, to the offender that they've apprehended. So again, I don't know. I mean, you draw a parallel that the dog's bitten someone. I think there's an equal argument if they're fleeing from police and running away and don't want to get apprehended. Often, my lived experience is the apprehension at the end is not necessarily as simple as giving up, and people can get hurt, unfortunately. All of which hopefully are subject to use of force reporting, analysis, review.
All of that's no doubt correct. But the point that we're at odds with, and which I won't labour too much more, is that we're putting to you that the time has passed as a community where we say that it's acceptable to use dogs to chase down and apprehend people at all. And particularly so in the Northern Territory where, as your own data shows, the typical person to receive that treatment is going to be an Aboriginal person.
And again, I think we're at odds. I think they're a valuable tool, and I think we should and could and will continue to use them. If we can come up with better tactics, all those things that we've discussed about previously, I think the Northern Territory Police was open to listening, open to look at best tactics, but they do provide a really, really valuable, I think, use of force option that is effective and, generically speaking, relatively safe when you've got people who may not want to be apprehended, may be violent.
Well, you've got alternatives already, which it seems that there's not enough resources to use them widely. But for instance, drones would be able to to affect most of the examples that you've given if someone runs off where they're hiding and so on. So that's a strategic decision, it's operational question of how much resources you have and so on. But you appreciate and accept, don't you, that drones are able to achieve most of the objectives if you're looking for a person who's run off and hiding.
Yeah, Your Honour, we're actively trying to enhance the capability of the Northern Territory Police Force. I think I've made some comments already in that submissions we're making. I think they are a really valuable tool. I think into the future they will provide a much more valuable role, but at the moment, today, 2023, they're not routinely available for us to use. And we are working on trying to close that gap as we speak.
In the data that is in NSA, and in your paragraph 159, you refer to some of it. Your paragraph 159 says in 2021 there were 14 instances where injuries were caused. See that?
Yes.
Now, just to move things along quickly, if I'm wrong, people can correct me, but looking at the data that you've provided, of those 14, 9 of those 14 were 24 years or younger. Accept that? I mean, we could go through it laboriously, but that's what the data shows.
If you say so, and I can't be...
I may make a mistake or so, but...
That's referred to in the data in the MS.
Yeah. The data in table 2 provides a lot of information. What it shows, amongst other things, is that 9 of the 14 people who were injured in 2021 were 24 years or younger. Follow?
Okay, accept.
And of those 9, 8 were Aboriginal and 1 is listed as unknown. So we don't know whether the 9th is Aboriginal or not. So either 8 or 9 of the 14 injured in 2021 were Aboriginal. Follow?
Yes.
And some of them were down to the age as young as 13. One of them was 13 years old, and one was 16 and so on, up to the age of 24. Do you understand?
Yes.
So what it's showing is that, and of the other, that's 9 who I'm saying are young, 24 under, and of the other 5, 3 were Aboriginal. So 11 or 12 out of the 14 are Aboriginal who were hurt by dogs in 2021. Follow? And I'm putting to you, so that's about every 4 weeks in 2021, an Aboriginal person was attacked by a police dog in the way that you described in your affidavit. I say attacked, I'm sorry, apprehended and injured by a police dog. Follow?
Yes.
Okay, so that's what the data shows, that's what your data shows. And what we're suggesting to you is that is, in itself, that is completely unacceptable. And it's even more unacceptable when you look at the range of penalties to which these offenders, not all of them were offenders, because some of them were not penalised at all, but the range of penalties which most of them had enforced upon them were light penalties, such as fines or a few days jail or no finding of guilt at all. Follow? That's about half of those young people.
So, but I don't necessarily follow suit, Your Honour, that the apprehension by the police and the outcome, how's that changed the tactics that are employed by the apprehending people?
Good question, and the point is, it should, precisely because the notion that we should use dogs to track and apprehend people for offending, when in fact, often they're young and often the crime which they're thought to have done is so slight that they're only getting a light penalty, shows a complete philosophical imbalance.
Police officers, Your Honour, are taught around the response at the scene. You know, we subsequent to the apprehension, they find out the age of the youth, for example. They didn't know that. You know, there's no evidence before me that they knew the age of whoever they were pursuing at the start. So
But what we've got now are some statistics. So what's being asked is a reflection based on the statistical evidence. In each case, a police officer may not know the age of the person that they're pursuing or seeking.
correct.
But statistically, we have learned through this analysis that many of those people will be under the age of 24 years, and many of them are being pursued for offences which are not of the most serious category. And therefore the question is really being asked to consider the proportionality in relation to the actions taken by police with the use of dogs, and whether, in light of those statistics, that is a proportionate response. Just in the same way that police considered how they apprehended people with offences on the road, and whether or not it was a proportional and appropriate response to pursue, and there's been obviously a lot of changes around that.
Thank you, Ron. I'll try and regulate it a little bit. I think from reflection, that's the injuries that we're talking about over those 21. I think there's some 5,000 deployments, you know, so there's, on the converse side of that, there's thousands of opportunities where no injury was done, where there was no apprehension. And I suppose, and again, Your Honour, I'm not trying to be difficult, but again, in the resourcing environment that we operate in, primarily the function, one of the primary functions, please, is that law enforcement investigate crimes that we get tasked to routinely.
So you would say that given the low number of injuries, the response is proportionate because it affects a number of positive outcomes without injury, and it's a valuable resource for that.
Yes, Your Honour.
And when you weigh it all up, proportionality suggests that in fact it's a helpful resource that potentially in fact reduces injury and conflict.
Yes, Your Honour.
Thank you for that summary, Your Honour.
I don't know if it's accurate. I don't know. I'm not sure that's exactly what you're saying, but
That's a very useful contribution. Thank you very much.
The only thing we'd add to what Your Honour said is that most of the injuries are minor. So fitting into the proportionality discussion, Your Honour.
Nevertheless, the propositions we are putting to you, to build on what has just been said by her, is that in a context where, with so many other steps that you're taking, positive steps of reform, we're putting to you that the use of dogs against people, where people overwhelmingly in this part of the world means Aboriginal people, because that's what's happening with the use of dogs from your own data, is something which is unacceptable, and it's a philosophical approach which should change. You're saying, well, I won't repeat what I said. You understand that's the debate we're having.
Yes, correct. And again, I think if I go back to the data, I haven't got it in front of me, but it's my reflection on reading it, that most of those are not at remote locations anyway. So most of them are used within an urban environment, either at Alice Springs or Darwin. So they're not, I don't think, routinely deployed to remote localities. And I think we heard evidence from Sergeant Donaldson that the dog, even in this instance, was left in the car. There was a number of factors that considered the use of it, and I think the IRT had deployed numerous times without it. So, I accept the proposition you've put and the explanations we've provided, but I don't think they're routinely deployed to remote communities, which may put some balance back into the context of Yuendamu and other locations.
Well, it's a helpful comment, but of course what we're dealing with here is what did happen at Yuendamu, and we're also dealing with your evidence, which was in your material, but is clearer that you've said it today, that you want this strategy of policing to grow.
I do.
And we are saying that it's an unacceptable cost in terms of trust between the police and the Aboriginal community, that the presence of dogs and the way that they work, which is to, as other witnesses have said, such as Acting Assistant Commissioner Wurst and Superintendent Nobbs, I think it was Nobbs. The idea is to instill fear and apprehension, and that approach to policing, coupled with your data, which shows that the injuries, which some of them are only trivial physically, but that takes no account of psychological harm and trauma to the person that apprehended by the dog, is an unacceptable cost.
Again, Your Honour, I would try to explain that as best I can. I think it's part of our,
I understand.
and ultimately, I think with everything we're talking about here is that ability to build a bridge back into any community. I think there are conversations that we can have around perhaps when those risk assessments we've talked about, if there's a true need to deploy them, if it's there, well then I'm not want to remove that option from experienced police officers to make sound decisions that actually may result in less injuries. They provide I think they provide an alternative, and I think that by continuing with our listening and that it may affect this data.
So my final proposition to you on this issue before we move on is that despite the answers you've given, that we suggest to you that the use of dogs, which generates the fear and apprehension of which we discussed, is in fact the antithesis of some of the other ideas that you've given evidence about for reform, that it breaks down trust, that it creates hostility between the population subject to the use of dogs and the police force.
Again, I think I've tried to be articulate as I can about what I think the future will hold for us. And, we're on the start of this journey. We're 3 years in now. We've got a long way to go. But I think the better we get, the more information, the more informed, the better relationships we form community. It will perhaps alter our tactical planning on the ground when we've got other alternatives.
All right, well, I think that's as far as we can go on that.
That's our intent.
Can I take you to another topic now, which is training and recruitment?
Yes.
And your evidence on the community resilience, and this is not a topic which is, I'm not taking any kind of...
Okay, thank you.
It's just a conceptual
Yes.
point. And it's in support not only of the reforms that you've been part of, but suggesting that in terms of training and recruitment, you can take some significant, valuable, much bigger steps. And what I've asked other witnesses,
Yes.
but because of your role as Deputy Commissioner and
Yes.
effectively the informant in this case, I'm
Yes.
taking you to
Okay.
You've described what CREC does and how valuable it is, and it does obviously show the Executive's commitment to reform and change.
Yes.
Built into a lot of what you said necessarily is how that reform and change is connected to the Aboriginal community.
Yes.
And what I want to suggest to you, which I've suggested to a couple of other witnesses from the Police College, is that in terms of education of people in training to be probation constables, that it would be a great benefit to take a much deeper dive into education about the Aboriginal population of the Northern Territory at the training college. And I'd put a figure of perhaps 6 or 7 weeks as opposed to 6 or 7 days in terms of training. And I said to another witness, unfortunately it could be Alan, but I may have forgotten his name.
Sergeant Allen, yes.
Might have been Sergeant Alan.
Now Senior Sergeant at the CREC.
That if you spend weeks focusing on Aboriginal Australia in your training for probationary constables, that your police force could actually become the gold standard for such training. And I've suggested that it would be a great way to attract a larger number of high quality recruits. It would probably weed out people who were put off by such an educational program in itself. And over time would have the effect of doing the things that you're trying to do right now, which would lead to a very significant cultural shift in the police force of Northern Territory. Do you want to comment on that?
Your Honour, I think in its philosophy, we're on the same page.
We're on the same page, but what I'm suggesting to you is, and really what I'm suggesting to you in each of these points, is that although the reform process in some of these areas is clearly on the right page, in the right direction from the point of view of my client, nevertheless, it's just too tentative a step. And what you need to do is to consider, as part of how your police will deal with my client in the future, is a process of education which is far greater and deeper than what you previously conceived, where you study, your recruits study Aboriginal history, Aboriginal law, bush tucker, culture, art, religion and so on, in a way which makes them fantastically trained in those things from the point of view of the community and police.
So again, thank you. I think the pathway runs evolutionary, Your Honour. We've commenced the process. Recruits undertake 7 months training now. 7 months is significant in what's a very, very tight operating environment. As we've heard, there are 3,000 additional police for Queensland, 3,000 additional police recruiting in, I think, Victoria. We've got WA wanting 950 cops. They're shopping at the moment to pick which is the jurisdiction that they would like to work for. We are very keen to ensure that it's us, that we attract the best people, we bring people into this operating context. And again, the stuff that the programs that are already undertaken by CREC start them on that journey, because it's a lifetime journey for a Northern Territory police officer. It's not just something you're going to do in 7 weeks. You're going to live here. If in our model, we want you to live here and protect and serve the Northern Territory for your whole life. We make the comment at many conversations with recruits and others. It says on our shoulder flash, we're the Northern Territory Police Force. We're not the Darwin Police Force. We're not the Alice Springs Police Force. We need to provide quality policing services right across the territory. And a condition of employment taken since 2020 has been that every single recruit that joins the Northern Territory Police must serve, is deployed out of Darwin, nobody goes to Darwin, and they must serve remote and regional within 6 years of commencement of their service. So it's a condition of employment to try and shift our thinking that we want you to be out there gaining as much experience as you can right across the territory. So I think all of those things combined will hopefully give us, and I don't have any objection to the suggestion that you make, that over time we have specific courses that will capture that. But again, I bring us back, I've heard some amazing stories about what we are doing out there, and we're trying to build on that. I think we've got the platform. It's going to take time.
So just to conclude on that point, and I hadn't even known until now, your point about contracted employment includes remote policing within 6 years, which sounds excellent. The final point to make is we are urging this because accepting, as you say, that it's a lifetime journey, but every step of that lifetime journey, especially those first few years, which are probably the hardest in some ways as someone learns how to be a good police officer, will be greatly enriched and be more effective if the police officers, as probationary constables, have a far greater in-depth training and understanding of Aboriginal culture and the other matters that I raised. Follow?
Agree.
I'm happy. I've got one large topic to go on, which Mr. President's suggesting lunchtime, and that might be useful. I might be able to trim it down over lunch. It's up to you.
Do you think you can finish by 1 o'clock?
Yes.
Then I'll sit.
So the final question or concept that I wish to discuss with you, ask you questions about, is the militarisation of the Northern Territory Police Force. And just to set up some concepts, militarisation can occur, whether it has occurred or not, I understand we have a discussion on that, but militarisation can occur both by philosophical choices that are made, but also perhaps through osmosis by the recruitment and retention of a large number of military personnel into an organisation such as NTP. Do you accept that?
I think in my affidavit and from Your Honour, my previous discussions, I don't broadly accept that in my thinking and what we're trying to achieve. So even with the employment data from the ADF, I think there's a significant difference in training standards between, a sailor and an airman and a combat infantryman. And, to broadly clump them all into the same bucket, I think is, very unhelpful for me to...
I'm going to give you
Please.
Chance as you need,
Thank you.
Subject to the 22-minute timeline, to
Okay, thank you.
Point out the differences between my client's perspective and your perspective. But we're just talking about categories and philosophy.
Thank you.
You used, in your statements, you said that the word militarisation is a pejorative term. And just to be clear, between my questions and you, and also for those watching, we're not suggesting at all that there aren't plenty of people from the Australian Defence Force or ex-ADF who are now in the Northern Territory Police Force who aren't doing an excellent job. That's not an issue. Follow?
Yes.
But in terms of militarisation, just so that we can have an agreed position on what it might mean, for the purpose of my questions, I suggest to you a working definition. I don't want to tie you down to each single word, but that militarisation involves the adoption of, or the integration of military approaches and military philosophy in the way an organisation works. Okay, that's a pretty sensible, neutral definition. You happy with that?
Yes.
That could include things like weapons and uniforms, which are external indicia, but also things like operational culture, how you do things on the ground. This is all obvious, isn't it? And an example of that, which I'll come back to in a few minutes, would in fact be the events of 9/11 at Yuendamu, which we would be suggesting to you is an example of militarisation in terms of how the event unfolded, that it had the whole look of a paramilitary operation around the house and what happened in that half an hour. You don't have to agree, but I'm just telling you that's,
Thank
that's
you.
where we're going.
I don't agree.
understand.
Yep.
And you've heard in this inquest me ask numerous witnesses about military language, which is now crept into the Northern Territory Police Force language. You've heard that evidence.
I'll take you from what clearer house, that language. So,
Language like clear a house, have an extraction from Yuendamu. So different witnesses have said yes or no whether this is military language, have an extraction from Yuendamu, talking about a mission, a force multiplier. So bringing in military terminology and language into Northern Territory policing.
okay. The senior executive, I've never used the term force multiplier.
I used it.
I was intrigued when I heard it. I have heard it used elsewhere in the military, but not from a policing context. And for the record, I've never served in the ADF.
Sure, but at least one witness had it in the statement.
Okay.
It was Kristen Bell, I can't remember which one it was. Kirsten. But the point is that there are multiple uses of military language which has become part of Northern Territory policing language. We're here to grab up Kumanjayi Walker. Is military rather than policing kind of language.
No, I'm not sure about that.
All right.
Grab up was more I would have thought of colloquial slang or something that was going to.
You've heard the talk of green rolls and black rolls. Have you heard that talk in the inquest?
You're on. Can you refer me?
RT training.
Oh, okay. Again, I think that referred to what type of uniform they'd wear. Were they wearing camouflage? Were they wearing their blues?
No, the green roll is doing, it does include the uniform, but it also includes the way
Surveillance tactics compared to something.
surveillance in country, creeping towards a target,
Okay.
with can near, fairly classic military type operation. And the black roll is to deal with urban or building environment where you're storming or securing.
I suspect, Your Honour, and again, I've not been a soldier or not been a tactical operator at the TRG, but again, I do know from my experience that we do use TRG terminology, again, as the basics. So there's interoperability that when they hand over, if it was a major event and the specialists turn up, they're all using the same terminology to know what they're talking about as a tactic. So you're not confusing, go to the front of the house, they use colours, as you know. They have there's specific things that they're taught to do. So to minimise the interoperability and confusion in a critical incident. So again, the things you talk about, I'm not quite sure that they are military terms. I know they're police terms, but I don't know that they're military terms.
Well, the transcript is there for
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
In terms of the TRG, for instance, do you accept that it's fair enough to describe that as a military type or paramilitary type organisation?
Well, it's a structured police unit that has got a
accept that.
very, very tight role to perform in the Northern Territory. One of those functions is our police tactical group, which is a requirement under the national auspices of the Australian New Zealand Counter-Terrorism Committee and a requirement by every police force. But they're a very unique unit. They're very specialised.
I accept that. But in nature, much more military than any other part of the Northern Territory Police.
I can see how the public can see that, yes, the vehicles they drive are rescue vehicles, an armoured vehicle that allows them to get close if there's people being injured or shot and without being injured, things like that. Albeit they're not tanks.
But it's an example, isn't it?
I accept that people may perceive it that way, yes.
And the elite nature, the excellence of their training and the type of thing they're trained for is in fact very similar to parts of the roles of the SAS, isn't it?
Well, again, I think we're getting down a zone that I don't believe that. I think the SAS have a really very specific role in the defence of Australia and in a military context that certainly the TRG's nothing like them. We would only use, under the counter-terrorism arrangement, we only call upon a tactical group from the military when it's beyond the capability of police. And there's yet to be an incident that I'm aware of in Australia where we've ever got to that point. So it may, I understand from an outsider looking in, they may draw that conclusion, but from what I know and what I've seen and what I've experienced, there's a vast difference. And the only time you would use the military is when it's beyond the capability and capacity of a jurisdiction.
Yeah.
And it has yet to be
Perhaps
that
very right,
threshold.
I'm not
Sorry.
suggesting that you're going to call in the SAS. I'm just putting a series of what I suggest particularly controversial ideas that the TRG has a military look about it, has a military feel about it. You've referred to vehicles, we could refer to weapons, training and so on. And their operability looks like more military than policing. Now it seems that's, if I may say so, fairly obvious. Not all day, every day.
Okay. They very rarely deploy into that high-risk role. And in fact, the vision I've just seen recently, they didn't have military clothing on at all, Your Honour. They were wearing covert clothing.
In terms of recognising the potential effect of having ex-ADF people in the police, you do now have, as I understand, a special training module.
We're trying to get a working group together, Your Honour. We've got a group of well-versed, experienced police officers that we know have got ADF backgrounds to try and help us explore this exact topic more deeply so we can provide appropriate support, I think, because it's very clear to me, and at least in my mind, the training that's delivered for police is fundamentally different than the training that's provided to a soldier. And
that's the fundamental issue that we have to grapple with. What we're suggesting that the Northern Territory Police Force needs to do is be far more upfront about the problems that can emerge from militarisation. And I'm going to put to you some propositions about militarisation. And I'm just pointing out to you right now that, in fact, it's a question of degree between us, because you've already accepted that the Northern Territory Police Force are looking at training models for ex-ADF, which tells us something about your thinking about ex-ADF, doesn't it?
yeah, to address this issue, and I think when we say training module, I don't know that it's necessarily going to be a formalised training module. I think it's going to be some ability for us to support ADF members, because I think they provide a valuable, and I've said that in evidence, I don't accept that they are not valuable for the Northern Territory Police or any police force.
Yeah,
Some of the positive skills they bring outweigh the risk to some of the other things that you've identified. Training, anyway, well, I've mentioned that previously. So I think it's not just we're trying to exclusively come up with a training model that's going to demilitarise a soldier. It's around a much more open, negotiated effect, and try and find out from those good police officers that we are that are ex-ADF, are there any issues that they've found? What do we see here? Is there anything you can suggest? So it's an ongoing process.
Well, we accept that, but what we're also going to be putting to you is that there's a degree of militarisation which is very worrying from what the evidence has revealed, and that the NTPF is trying to grapple with it. That needs to do a great deal more. You understand? And for instance, using your own affidavits, in your third affidavit, and I'm not going to take to these paragraphs, but for the benefit of others, paragraph 469, you explain that you can't monitor ex-ADF for that reason alone, because they're ex-ADF and use of force, because it's discriminatory. Okay, so you said that as a basic proposition. On the other hand, in the same affidavit, you and in your evidence just now, you recognise the need for extra training modules for ex-ADF.
Awareness sessions, perhaps, as opposed to training models.
Yep. Sorry, I spoke over.
Thank you.
In your first affidavit, you say the new module at 236 is to assist in the deculturation of ex-ADF personnel. Follow?
Yes, I do.
So to some extent, you're recognising those problems, that there should be deculturation of ex-ADF personnel. And some training is going to be needed to do that.
I agree that we are taking steps to address that, yes.
And implicit in that is because, and I appreciate what you say about someone who's an aircraft mechanic or working in a ship in some ways different from a soldier in the field and the training that they have. So we'll focus on Army when we're talking about ex-ADF. But implicit in what you've already recognised in your own statements is that soldiers, by their training, and there's no criticism of this, we as a nation have made a decision forever as a nation since 1900 that we should have a defence force, and they are trained to go and kill people when they're ordered to do so. And to that extent, their training is tough, and the reality is it dehumanises them to the point, and this is a carefully structured point that the Army works on, to the point that they're able to go and kill people when most of us would recoil from that. So that's the nature of their training. That's all pretty obvious, isn't it?
I accept your proposition at high level. I don't know what training they do as a general principle.
You don't need to know.
They're soldiers, they go and do what soldiers do.
You know they're trained to kill. You're not disputing that.
I think it's broader than that, though.
Of course it's broader than that. They're trained to do many other things. Build bridges when there are floods in the bush. But they're also trained to kill, and that's why you, as a police force, are already accepting the fact that you need to deculturate them from that kind of training.
And other aspects of perhaps of their culture that it may not sit nicely or evenly with the Northern Territory Police Force, but not that just that principle.
Of course there are many differences, but we're just zeroing in on the critical issue. The critical issue which I'm putting to you is that that's what it's about. The difference between what soldiers do in their training and what you need to do is serving the community in community policing. You have to identify that difference, which...
Our training clearly delineates that now. You know, they're taught to do things as a Northern Territory police officer. And that may be contrary to whatever other training they've received. Our expectation is they comply with our training, our instructions, and comply with what they're taught to do. And by and large,
Sorry, Mr.
and by and large, as I understand it, works quite effectively. As I said, we've got some really good...
So the difference between us really, Deputy Commissioner, is one of degree. And I'm going to take you to the Kumanjayi Walker incident and then some of the Proctor's material, which you've obviously considered carefully. But we've put to a number of witnesses, and I'm suggesting to you to give a chance to comment on it, that what happened on the 9th of 11 is an example of how militarisation can affect police work. To give you some examples, and putting aside the whole question of the breakdown between Sergeant Frost and the IT when they arrive, but when they get to the house, we suggest that the manner of handling Kumanjayi Walker in the house was confrontational and aggressive, and not what you would describe as good policing.
I'm still grappling, sorry, with your first premise that an example of militarisation. I don't accept that either.
I'm just going to give you a series of
Okay,
points to
but
make the...
but I think if you gloss over the first bit, the second bit doesn't hold suit to me.
Well, we'll see. We'll see.
Okay.
Give me a moment. The use of the long arm, poor policing.
Outside of what I would have thought was necessary, yes, we've discussed it, we've apologised. I think there was a lack of direction in that.
Being asked to respond to each of these, I don't know, Mr. McMahon, I thought you were just going to list a number of things which you say are examples of militarisation, or do you want a response to each item?
No, there's no need to do.
Okay, well, I'll listen,
Just
Your Honour.
list your items and then
Sorry,
you can ask
sorry,
the
Your Honour.
question.
So, suggesting a number of factors such as the way that the IRT men moved around the house, some of them jumping fences, carrying the AR-15 when you would say, and others have said they don't need to be carrying the AR-15. The way that they physically handled Kumanjayi Walker, the combination of those factors and is an example of what we would put to you as a paramilitary field rather than a policing field when they're actually carrying out the operation.
Well, I didn't see it in those lights. My view, Your Honour, that I think they were operating as common sense policing in the terms there was a plan. I would have thought if you're an ex-trained soldiers who are trained to a high level in tactical planning and tactics, we would have seen something different than what we saw. I saw police officers operating as police officers would. You know, even if there's no formal plan, you don't all walk in the front door of a house. You'd expect common sense to have someone's got to go to the back. I don't know if that's a military experience, but my experience as a police officer, that level of two to the front, two to the back, I've never been a soldier. That was ingrained in our dynamic nature of when you respond to any task, go and do this, do that, cover exits, look at points, protect yourself, lots of things. I don't know so that some of that military training and what police training may be mutually supportive, but I didn't see it as a military style.
Your Honour, with respect, there does seem to be a bit of a breakdown between what our learned friend is wanting to raise, because it's been put in a multi-part preliminary, and what the witness is now answering. It might be helpful if each component is put explicitly as an incident of militarisation. The witness might be able to give a more responsive answer.
Well,
Sorry, Ms. I might be a bit confused.
No, that's right. And with respect to Mr. Fregel, Dr. Fregel, I'm not going to do that now because of the. I think the witness's position is clear based on what I've put to him, and I understand the difference between our perspective and his perspective, and I don't need to draw it up. In your final affidavit, you, and possibly an audio affidavit, you deal with some of the work of, I'm afraid I don't know the rank of Proctor. What was his rank?
Commander.
Commander Proctor. And can I take you, perhaps this can be put up on the screen, I think this one's organised, page 139 of Proctor's large report, the Coronial investigation report. Is that one of the ones that was organised?
Do you mean paragraph?
No, I mean page 139 of Proctor's report.
Oh, thank you.
Is that Proctor?
No. The second one? Not, you've just clicked on the top, yeah. No, that's the Canine one, the other one, yeah, the Coronial memo, yeah. I think it'll be that one, yeah. What page was it?
139.
Who responded to and for?
Yes, that's his. Do you see that? It's a bit hard to read, I think.
Yeah.
I can see it.
Okay, so the point I'm taking to, just because in your affidavit you dealt at some length with some of the propositions that Commander Proctor's dealt with.
Yeah.
And I want to take you to one particular line and that graph at the top of the table at the top of the page. You'll see that it's a table which deals with accoutrement usage across use of force incidents.
Yeah.
And in your affidavit at 216 you refer to this, and at 220 you point out a number of weaknesses in the data analysis.
Yes.
This is your third affidavit.
Yep.
And I'm not going to debate those with you. The point is, if you look at the line which says ex-defence, which is about 5 lines down. You see the first line is roll with a number of incidents.
Yeah.
And then you go down 3 or 4 lines and you see ex offence. Can you see that?
Yes.
And I just want to give you a chance to comment on this. I know in paragraph 220 you say there are problems with this analysis because the various factors are not taken into account. But the raw data that he's extracted is that in terms of the right-hand column, firearm usage and presentation, with the exception of the column involving the individual constable role, the ex-defence personnel have the highest presentation firearm and firearms. See that?
Yes.
And pretty much that's the point I want to take you to. So
Again, Your Honour, if I can be reflected back to my earlier evidence and the affidavit, I think I tried to give some clarity around, I think, the intent on the analysis of the data provided by Commander Proctor has been the subject of much further delving and diving by the Northern Territory Police Force to try and validate and otherwise around the data, and it didn't lead us to any significant conclusions that identified that the ADF were any more likely to use force than any other member, bearing in mind they were...
That's a different point. It's not on the use of force generally, it's on the use of firearms that you're being directed to here.
Again, Your Honour, without further analysis, give me some time to contemplate those data in my earlier report. I accept what the Proctor report showed, and again, I'll have to refer back. It'll take me time to have a bit of a dive around in my toolbox here to find out if I can give you further clarity. I'm happy to take that away, but on the I accept that the data they had there, that's before us.
Dr. Freckleton might be able to help you out later. You don't have to, I don't think, grapple with it now. I mean, this data speaks for itself, but you say this data on further review may not have been able to be replicated, but I'm sure Dr. Freckleton might be able to clarify.
And I'm not, yeah, thank you, Your Honour. I'm just not sure it provides the same reflective piece as what it shows in that first draft. So
all right.
I'll take that away.
Just, as I'm trying to be fair to you, in your paragraph 220, you or your researchers have set out for you a number of problems with the data.
Yes.
And it sounds to me like you've said that, and I accept that there are problems with any of the data in the Proctor report or any of the data in your affidavits. The point about the data is not that we live or die by it, but that it provides a useful guide for further reflection, as you pointed out. But what it does show there is that there is a high use of firearm usage presentation in that data, which is, as has clearly been the case, the cause of generating further analysis and reflection within the Northern Territory Police Force. Your Honour, I know that Dr. Freckleton will have questions, and I've got just a couple, maybe 5 more minutes to go.
I think we have to break.
All right, we'll break.
Have our lunch adjournment. But again, given our tight schedule, I'm going to be back at 1:45.
All set, or you've got some stuff early adjourned?
Okay.